All right. Alex, I think we can start. Um, Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon in Denmark, Sweden, and good morning in the US to Alex. Thank you, everyone, for
Good
joining us
morning.
today to navigate about the FDA. And today we have the pleasure of having Dr. Alex Cadotte, who is a big expert in the FDA regulatory strategies, specialized in digital health and medical device software, especially including in AI and ML. And if I forgot something, Alex, please add.
No, that's
Um,
great.
we're here to navigate and help you scale to the US. And Alex will tell you more about MCRA and what they do and what you should bear in mind whenever you are thinking about scaling to the US. So, Alex, thank you so much for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Oded. So I'm going to kind of go through things here, what to expect. I'm a pretty informal presenter, so please feel free to interrupt me, raise the hand on uh, the Teams chat, or just speak up. It's fine. You can interrupt me. If we want to have a side discussion about some of these things, I'm happy to do so. I've already shared the slides with Oded, and he is also recording. So you should be able to share some of this material internally within your companies and such. I'd like to ask you to kind of keep it within this group, but very happy to have you have this information. So my contact information, which will be part of this slide deck, is right there for my micro email address. Let's see. For my agenda, I'm going to have a really brief introduction to MICRA and the team that I run for digital health, just so you see some of the people involved and some of the areas that we've grown. And then we're going to get right into regulatory topics, which will include FDA 101. For those of you that are already a little bit familiar with FDA, this may be a little basic, but I wanted to cover this anyway. And then once we get done with that, we may take a short break. And then we'll move into digital health specific topics that may have a little bit more relevance for your SAMD devices and other things that you may be working on. And as I said, just interrupt me whenever you want with questions. I will pause kind of at between these different modules to see if there are questions. Um, One thing I will say is I'm a little under the weather, so I may go off camera once in a while. I don't think you want to see me sneezing or blowing my nose, but it is what it is this time of year. So with that, I'm Alex Cadotte. I'm the Vice President of Digital Health, AI, and Radiology at MICRA. I've been with MICRA for about 4 years. I was with the US FDA for 6 years. And the interesting thing about my time at FDA is that I was in the right place at the right time for kind of the AI growth within the agency. Radiology is still where about 70 to 80% of the AI devices are coming through FDA. It was closer to 90 to 100% at the time that I was at FDA in up to 2001. Um, and then just a little bit more background on me. I participated on a lot of policy with FDA in things like predetermined change control plan, clinical decision support. These are things you'll be finding in the presentation today. Before FDA, I was actually in industry for a while in the neuroelectrophysiology device space, and I used to be a researcher in basically epilepsy and autism, doing things like brain-computer interface, brain mapping, and electrophysiology. So my general expertise is 510K, Q submissions, breakthrough, PCCP, and de novo. I work on an occasional part of a PMA, but in radiology, they're not very common. Also, have experience with my team for designing FDA clinical trials and, of course, AI machine learning expertise. As far as MICRA is a global CRO. We are recently acquired by IQVIA, so we're an IQVIA business. Our claim to fame here is that we have 25 plus ex-FDA officials. We have a very strong record in PMAs, which is the most difficult type of submission. We have a pretty robust group of people that have been here pretty much the entire time that I have. People are pretty happy here and they continue working. We also have reimbursement, which is a very important thing to start with. I'm not going to be covering that much in today's presentation, but just letting you know, we offer other services. We also have international regulatory. So if you do have some questions outside of the US, we do have expertise there. And of course, being a CRO, we've worked with thousands of sites. And if you now consider the fact that we're part of IQVIA and the network that they have access to, that's quite a bit. So just kind of going quickly through. As I mentioned, we're a CRO. We have global regulatory, reimbursement, health economics, and market access. We also have a quality assurance staff that helps you get your quality system up and running, healthcare compliance and GDPR, cybersecurity, which is one of the teams that I have under me, due diligence, as well as our AI and imaging center, which I'll get to in really briefly. I'm trying not to drag this out too much, but I just wanted to introduce some of my people here. Hava Zidman's ex-FDA. She's a statistician, which can be really valuable when you're designing your studies, to have somebody with that ex-FDA expertise. Sam Engelman's been in regulatory for 10 to 15 years. He's an excellent project manager. He specializes in EMC. Let's see. Dee Lu is a manager on my team. She is trained in usability, so very helpful for human factors studies and various other questions there. Nidhi Ghani is my cybersecurity manager, and she helps a lot of our clients navigate the cybersecurity landscape with FDA, which I will tell you is challenging. It's kind of the dark horse as a consideration that many people don't realize. Also, our AI and Imaging Center. The idea of the AI and Imaging Center is that we collect data for the purpose of running studies to validate your device basically in the way that FDA would expect. Myself and Nima Aklagi, who I'll introduce in a moment, we basically use our ex-FDA expertise to design your study. Then we can run it and document it and then package it up into your 510K. So the general idea here is just having FDA reviewers building your study for your device, which, most recently we had a submission go to FDA and receive 0 deficiencies. So it kind of highlights our knowledge in this space and ability to get things on the market. Is there a problem with the presentation, Oded?
At least for one, but I can see the slides, so I believe it shouldn't be a problem. Is there anyone else?
Just ignore me. I'm joining from my phone, so feel free to just ignore that.
Okay.
All right. As I mentioned, Nima and I work together at FDA. He also is from the Rad Health Group, so he's the director of the AI and Imaging Center. Him and Jenny Trieber work on the operations side of the AI Imaging Center, and as I mentioned, we design, run, and document studies to help you get through FDA for your AI machine learning devices. So with that, I'm ready to kind of jump into the more interesting content of Regulatory 101. Where we usually start things with a discussion of FDA is the definition of a medical device. I'm not going to read the whole definition here, but I'll pause to let you kind of read that it's a very specific definition. The part that's probably the most important: intended for the use and diagnosis of disease or other conditions, or in the cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease in man or other animals. I did want to mention with this definition that diagnosis, it isn't that, if you're not diagnosing a disease, that you're not a medical device. If you're providing diagnostic information that can help a doctor diagnose a disease, that's enough to meet this definition of a medical device. Let's see. So with FDA, everything is intended use. Intended use is basically, if you think about everything that you would include in a documentation package that you would send to FDA, every document that you submit, everything that you say about your device can be considered by FDA to be part of your intended use. So that includes things like your labeling, which is can include like your marketing claims, your user materials, oral and written statements that you make about your device, and also implied and express claims. So intended use is made up of a lot of different factors. It can get into the very specifics of your patient group. This can get down to, specific age ranges, specific disease states, specific population components. Also, another part of the intended use is who the user of the device is. So, for me, it's often a radiologist with a lot of the things that I work on. But depending on who might be using your device for various diagnostic activities, it's very important to understand and address who would be using your device. Also, the use environment can be very important. That's a little bit more important with devices that have hardware, just simply because things like EMC matter if you're going to be in a hospital setting. And then, another example of things that contribute to indications for use are anatomical sites. So one thing that is often confusing for a lot of people is this idea of intended use versus indications for use. As I mentioned earlier, intended use is basically anything and everything you say about your device, anything that's written down, anything that's on your website. The indications for use is a formalization of the intended use. So it's actually a document name that's part of your submission. So it's kind of a formalization of the intended use. And FDA spends a lot of time as part of their regulation making sure that the indications for use that you've written down actually matches the intended use that you describe in the rest of your submission. So let's try to do a little bit interactive here. Maybe if you want to spit out like a target user or some of these other questions, we'll drop a indications for use statement. If you want to do it with your own device that you're working on, happy to do that with you. But my first question, if I was working with you, is who are your target users? Don't be shy now. All right. If nobody's going to volunteer, I'll just make up my own medical device. So since I'm familiar with radiology, let's just say a radiology device for lung nodule detection. And what disease or population are you looking to target? In the United States, lung nodules are kind of an interesting disease state. There's a lot of people that have a history of smoking. Julia, diabetes.
Yeah, diabetes, yes.
Okay. So we'll switch that over to the chemistry group at FDA, and whatever physician would be ordering maybe a diabetic test. In this case, it's probably the user is the person with their own CGM. So with that disease population, you could narrow down the diabetic population by age. You could, if there's a particular subgroup of diabetics that are more specific to your device, you can limit your intended use to them. I'm not an expert at diabetes, so I'll do my best here. And where do you intend to expect your product to be used? I think with continuous glucose monitors and various other components, these are home use with the patient type of devices most often. And how do you want your device outputs to be used? And that's really important. As you're likely aware, these patients are using the output from these systems in order to figure out dosing for insulin, understand their blood sugar so that they basically can make it through another day. And also, with the diabetes product, it kind of answers this question quite nicely in the sense that while this would be a device that would be in the hands of a patient, they would have to get a prescription in order to have a CGM most of the time. So that would be another part of the use case and the labeling. So if you kind of strung all of those things together, you may formalize an intended use for your device just by kind of summarizing all those things into a document. And then you kind of format it, make it a little bit more specific. And that might be an indications for use statement that gets included with either your 510K, your de novo, or other regulatory submissions with the agency. So this is a really important process because if you get it wrong, FDA is going to be confused the entire time that you're interacting with them. This is an exercise that I would suggest going through in a lot more depth before you interact with FDA. Because what ends up happening is FDA looks at your device, asks these questions of what you've provided to them in your package, and is always thinking about the classification of your device. It's a pretty straightforward classification. Class 1 is the lowest risk. Class 2 is kind of where most of your 510Ks are. There's exceptions to some of the things I'm saying here, but I'm not going to focus on that. Class 3 is generally where you have a PMA. That is a long and arduous submission, usually reserved for the highest risk devices. Class 2, it's kind of interesting. It used to be there was a process with PMA that would have your device on the market as a Class 3 for a number of years, and then it would get down classified to Class 1 or 2. FDA decided to speed that process up with what's called a de novo. So it's basically a benefit risk submission that at the end of it, FDA classifies your device as either Class 1, Class 2, or Class 2 with special controls. Special controls are basically specific things that you have to do for your specific device, and anybody that does a 510K relative to your device has to do those things as well. So there is a little bit of, and I realize this is a little bit more SAMD focused. I'm sure some of you are working on SIMD applications. SIMD is software in a medical device. SAMD is software as a medical device. FDA put out a lot of guidances kind of in the late 2015, 2020 time period where they basically defined on paper what things that were a medical device and what things were not. There's a lot of things that FDA just doesn't need to have oversight of. Probably the biggest exemption there is things that are for general wellness. Although one of the things I will tell you about general wellness, it's not always the best thing to be a general wellness device, because oftentimes if you want your device to be reimbursed in the United States, there's a pretty good correlation between being kind of a Class 2 medical device and getting reimbursed for your device. So, if FDA says, oh, this is a low-risk device, we don't need to see anything, it's very likely that it might not be that useful because it's not that risky. It's not always true, but just wanted to point that out. But basically, there's a lot of functions that aren't regulated by FDA. There are a body of things that meet the definition of a medical device that are not actively regulated by FDA, and then there's the devices that are more the focus of FDA's oversight. So give me a moment here. I need to... For that. If you're going to start doing regulatory strategy, this is where you start using some of the databases that FDA has in order to figure out if there's other devices that are similar to what you've done. These are some screenshots from some of the FDA databases. There's the PMA database, 510K database, and de novo. This is where the majority of submissions from FDA are between these three. The 510K is by far the largest one. I've included a link here if you wanted to navigate this, but you could also just put in a Google search for FDA databases and you'd be able to get to these pretty quick. As you can see, there's a lot of different fields that you can use here to help you find and search for a predicate. This is most often the thing that we do with clients, is helping them understand if the 510K pathway is available to them by finding a suitable predicate. A 510K submission is basically saying, my device is the same as this device. Maybe not precisely that, but that's essentially what you're doing. Whereas when you're doing a de novo or a PMA, it's usually something that's higher risk or doesn't have a classification, meaning it's pretty new. De novo in Latin means of the new. Let's see. One of the things that you'll often hear about from a classification perspective, FDA offers a mechanism called a 513G, which is you provide FDA a description of your device. They provide you back what they think the classification is. This is not a process that I actually recommend because FDA is not interactive as part of this process. It's kind of, if you put a bad submission into them, you're going to get bad feedback from them. So it may or may not actually reflect what actually is your device, and FDA will read the entirety of this and go with their highest risk interpretation of what your device does, which doesn't always make sense. So There are specific times when a 513G can be useful, but it's generally not something I recommend. Just mostly because you don't get any screen time with FDA or review staff. The 513G mechanism has a user fee associated with it, just like a 510K or a de novo or PMA. Last I checked, I think it's like $3,000 to $5,000. So I tend to think your money is better spent elsewhere. I could probably tell you everything that FDA would tell you for a good share of devices that are out there. Um, So I think most of you are already here because you realize that your medical devices may be regulated by FDA. So it's really a question of, with the information that I've given you here, where do you fit? Do you already have a good understanding of where you fit? Have you done your own research a little bit? But, class one is typically something that's lower risk. You don't necessarily have to do a pre-market submission with FDA or 510K, whereas Class 2 is kind of the bulk of FDA, as I mentioned earlier. If you're looking for reimbursement, it's usually better to be a Class 2 device, just as a rule of thumb. Class 1, sure, there's times when it makes sense to get your device out on the market and kind of maybe add your higher risk features later, but it's kind of a trade-off. You basically get less claims about your device for having a less risky device. And Class 3, of course, is the highest risk, and those submissions take a lot of time. So let's talk a little bit about pre-market requirements. Regardless of what your regulatory submission is, whatever you present to FDA, any claims that you make about your device, for like your diabetic software, if you're going to make a claim about it, whether explicit or implicit, FDA is going to require evidence to validate your claim. FDA gives you nothing for free. So a lot of times it's really important to make sure that you're not making extraneous marketing claims. My device is better than every other CGM on the market. Well, if you put that in your regulatory submission with FDA, they're going to make you prove it.
Alex,
Yeah.
we have one question from the audience by Son. He writes, I have come across the expression FDA registered medical device. What does it mean for class 1?
So that's a little bit of a side conversation, which I'll go into here.
Okay.
Registration is something that everyone that has a regulated medical device has to do. Registration, like if you go into FDA for your first 510K and you get it cleared, when you start to distribute your medical device in the United States, you have to register and list. It's basically filling out a form, telling FDA where your company is headquartered, who the contact is for your company. And what registration and listing does is it sets you up to be inspected by FDA potentially at some point in the future. So now they know who you are, they know that you're going to be marketing a medical device, and now you're subject to the quality systems regulation. So what will often happen for a routine inspection is that you'll get an email or a note from a inspector on your door at your company that says, hey, I'm going to be here in a week for an inspection, please prepare. For a lot of companies, the first time they do that, that is a very terrifying event. But I will say that Dan Goldstein from our team does a really great job with first-time inspections. He tends to run a back room so that you're educating your people what to say, what not to say. I think what I've heard from him is a lot of people the first time they have something with FDA is they talk too much, which isn't necessarily what you want to do. But just kind of mentioning that we have services to help prepare for that and also to help you during the actual submission, or not submission, the inspection. I'm going to go off camera here for a second. Sorry for those of you that joined late. I'm a little sick, so I guess I just don't think you want to see me blowing my nose. Does that answer your question about registration?
So I'm just writing the chat, and if you have more questions, maybe we can take them later as well. Yeah, he says yes.
Yep. Okay. Let's see. So, a big challenge for regulatory strategy is often figuring out what level of evidence that you need in order to satisfy FDA when you put in your submission. There's a lot of questions that you can ask, or I can ask, to understand your device. Do you have hardware as part of your device? That's basically anything that's not software. Does my product include AI machine algorithms? That's kind of a big part of the reason why we're here today. Does my product use off-the-shelf components? Off-the-shelf is a term that describes using other people's software and kind of assuming the risks related to that software. You're literally pulling it off the shelf and using it as part of your device. Does my product include in-house developed software? That's most of the time the case, that companies are developing their own product. Does my product make physical contact? That usually highlights the need for biocompatibility testing. It doesn't need to be sterile, so that you basically need to do sterility testing. Does my product share information and data wirelessly? Basically, if your device has software, you're going to have to do cybersecurity these days. So FDA is pretty tough on this. Like, if you try to avoid cybersecurity regulation by saying, oh, my device is locked down, it doesn't communicate with anybody, sorry, you still have to do cybersecurity if it has any ability when it's being developed or when it's being used to access the software. And I don't want to give you any hope that you can get around cybersecurity. You're gonna have to do it, is basically my message there. If you have software as part of your device, and firmware is included as part of software. And does my product connect to another device? That's partially cybersecurity, but it's also meaning that you're going to have to account for the risks of that device that you might be interacting with. So clinical validation testing, for devices that don't have a pretty straightforward bench testing requirement. A lot of times you have to run that study. You may have to collect clinical data. There's a whole process of basically, especially for riskier devices, that you have to do an IDE with FDA. I don't have a huge amount of expertise with IDE because most of the time software devices don't require an IDE. It's not always true, but most of the time. And then most software, if it's software by itself, kind of falls in this non-significant risk, meaning you don't need an IDE in order to run your study. But when you do require an IDE, just a heads up, that's also a pretty rigorous submission. And if you've got a high-risk device like an implantable or something like that, or you're working with an implantable and controlling some of its functions, for example, those are things that will factor into whether you'd need clinical testing or whether you'd be able to do bench testing. Moving on, this slide is a little bit outdated in the sense that this isn't the only information that FDA has out there for AI machine learning devices. Just last month, FDA put out a draft guidance for AI machine learning device functions. I thought about including a link here, but that's a pretty easy Google search. Just type FDA AI machine learning device function guidance, and you'll find it pretty quickly. A draft guidance is put out there for the purpose of getting comment from the public before it becomes final. So if you want to participate in that process, you're welcome to read the guidance, provide FDA feedback on it. But the nice thing about a draft is it gives you a little bit of information on the latest thinking from FDA. However, FDA is not supposed to cite a draft guidance as a final guidance. So there's a little bit of nuance there, but technically speaking, these guiding principles are part of that draft guidance now. There's a lot more specificity there. Probably the most important ones, which I'll go over a little later, are the ones in kind of the 3 through 7 area. This is mostly focusing on the data that you would be collecting in order to run your study. And also the design of your device. I have a section on that later, so I'm not going to go into depth just yet. Let's see. Class 3 pre-market approval. This is PMA. I'm not going to go super deep into these because I would just be regurgitating what's on these slides. I think if you want to read these later and kind of follow these links, but a class 3 device is usually your most challenging submission type. So one of the things you ought to be thinking about now for your device is, what testing do you think you need to support a marketing application? I'm going to give maybe 10 seconds there if somebody wanted to talk about that for their own particular device, and if not, I'll continue to move on. Are there draft guidances that remain in draft status for years? Yeah, that actually happens quite often. The question is, are there draft guidances that remain draft status for years but still represents FDA's thinking and are good to use? The answer is yes. I mean, they still have that designation as being a draft, but I can tell you with a lot of certainty right now that all the things that are in the draft guidance for AI machine learning are things that FDA is actively doing. So if you follow the guidelines there, it's going to help you get your submission through FDA. And why would they remain in draft status for so long? Well, that's the inefficiency of government. It's supposed to be a process by which, the US citizens and corporations provide comment back to FDA to kind of make sure that whatever they're putting out is fair and is reflective of the real world. So there's a lot of law related to this Federal Register process that is necessary in order to get a guidance finalized. And what can I say? The US government is a big, slow turtle. And it takes many times 3 to 5 years for a guidance to go draft to final. Although digital health has been doing a pretty good job. I used to be part of digital health when I was at FDA. So maybe I'm patting myself on the back here, maybe not. But they usually get their guidances out in maybe 2 to 3 years instead of 3 to 5. So that's kind of fast for FDA. Let's see. Let's move on. FDA submission types and timelines. This is rather binary. Again, I'm not going to go through every single one of these parts of the flowchart, but a pre-submission is a process by which you interact with FDA, and the timeline is generally from the time you submit it, and on average until the time you have your meeting with FDA, it's roughly 75 days. It's an opportunity for you to describe your device, describe your problem, ask questions of FDA. They'll provide written feedback to you, and then they'll have a 1-hour meeting with you. Sometimes you can get a little bit more time out of FDA, but they're often reluctant to do that unless there's a specific reason. So this kind of gives you a rough timeline of that. Oftentimes when you have a more complex device, it is good to check in with FDA before you submit your submission so that you understand what FDA's requirements for performance testing are before you run your study and submit your device. It is the worst situation to be in where you run your study, you spend all your venture capital money on your study, and then FDA says, yeah, this is a nice study, but it's not going to work. Can you run another one? So this is why this exists. Also, I can tell you that's candidly why people like myself and Micra exist, is because we kind of can give you the same information. We often save our clients a Q-sub interaction or maybe get them to the second or third interaction and answer all their questions. So maybe their first time interacting with FDA is a little bit more useful. So 510K, this is a 90-day process. The 90 days is how much time it's with FDA. During the middle of that 90 days, FDA will put your submission on hold. It can be on hold for up to 180 days. So the whole process at its maximum can go 270 days, a little bit less than a year. If you don't resubmit your 510K after that 180 days, it's considered automatically withdrawn. So the timelines here are pretty straightforward for 510K. Let's see, moving on to de novo. De novo is usually a little bit beefier than a 510K. The main difference between a de novo and a 510K is about substantial equivalence. You're basically telling FDA my device is the same as this other device that's already on the market. A de novo kind of acknowledges that your device is new, and instead of the bar being the same, the bar for de novo is the benefit for the device is greater than the risk. So this takes FDA a little bit more time to review. If I remember correctly, I haven't done one in a little while, but I believe it's 150 days for a de novo. And they will put you on hold somewhere there in the middle, and you have 180 days to respond, very similar to a 510K. Moving on.
Yeah, just before, if that's possible, Arkan, you have a question?
Yeah, hey Alex. So I was thinking about the 510K. If you have a device and you point to another device and say, all right, I'm using this as a predicate, but then they discover some issue with the predicate device, does that mean your device will also then be hit by the fallout of that, and
It
maybe have
can.
to stop selling?
It can in some cases. I have seen this happen before with devices in radiology, where they discovered that devices were chronically missing a certain type of finding. And basically FDA made sure that it was labeled correctly. So all the devices in that device class had to fix that problem. So you can imagine a lot of companies got a knock on their door from FDA, and they were calling me because they were very stressed out because FDA was contacting them. This was in the stroke triage space. For individual devices, it used to be that FDA could not tell you that your predicate was invalid if it was part of the regulation, even if it did have a problem. But there is a controversial draft guidance that's out there that allows FDA to tell you, hey, your device, your chosen predicate is not modern enough to claim substantial equivalence to. So it's been kind of a frustrating thing for a lot of clients in the sense that FDA often uses this to kind of slow down a submission. It's not always obvious because you don't know necessarily what the problem with that device is. FDA can't really tell you sometimes, but they'll kind of cryptically tell you, hey, there's a problem with this device. You need to find a different predicate. So that does happen on occasion. It used to be pretty rare. It's still pretty rare, but it's a little bit more common than it used to be. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and a follow-up to that, you said that sometimes a predicate can be too old. So let's say you find two devices that could be your predicate. One is 10 years old, one is 2 years old. Would you then
Right.
strategically go for the one that's 2 years old?
It depends. Is like that's kind of something that, at least for me, when I'm doing regulatory strategy, we'll look at the device, see if it's still valid. Since I used to work at FDA, at least in radiology, I have a good sense of some things that are a little bit off limits versus things that are in bounds. But it's very subjective. There's a lot of times where people still use 10, 20, 30-year-old predicates, but then they might have to use what's called a reference device to cite maybe that 2-year-old device to show FDA how they're kind of implementing that device with modern technology. So there's ways to kind of describe that to FDA that usually fall out as part of the regulatory strategy. I've actually got a client right now that's trying to use a 25-year-old predicate, which should be fine because it's not a high-risk device. But as you can imagine, software development has changed a lot in 25 years. So if FDA technically wanted to be obstructive there, they might be able to. But I think it's fairly unlikely for this particular client because there's plenty of examples of newer devices out there that they could switch to. A lot of times for these older devices, what you're trying to do is point out to FDA specific situations or specific intended uses that are included within a regulation that you just want them to be aware of. FDA's institutional memory is not that great. I mean, sure, they have all the documents from these 510Ks from 25 years ago, but the average life of a reviewer is about 5 years. For example, I was at FDA for 6 years. So a lot of reviewers basically get to the point where they've reached the top of what they can do for their entire career at FDA, and they either have to accept that or leave. So that's quite often the reason why FDA doesn't have all this institutional memory. Sometimes I've run into situations that I'm telling people about devices. Interestingly enough, since I used to work there, new people have started working there where I've had people lecturing me on regulations that I wrote and explaining it to me. And I've actually asked the lead reviewer, it's like, hey, whose signature is on that memo for this particular device? There's a pause, and then they go and they see my name, and it's like, oh. So it's kind of a tricky thing for me. I have to be wary of conflict of interest, but like, I can't actually use that as something with FDA, but that's kind of my clever way of just reminding them I know what I'm talking about. Anyway, that does come up. It's a very good question. It's often a challenging situation because most people that cite older devices have a specific reason they're citing that older device. So they're often very attached to that idea. So if you're running into something like that yourself or someone else, that is a tough problem to address sometimes. I encourage you to seek out help from somebody experienced, whether it's me or someone else that kind of understands how FDA operates here. Did that answer your second question?
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm going to try to speed things up a little bit here. I had covered IDE. IDE is interesting. This is the investigational device exemption, so that you can perform your study for a higher risk device. The most important thing, 30-day review, fast, furious. Your head's gonna spin basically by the time FDA reaches their decision. These are quick for a reason, and FDA will deny your study if they don't think that your device is safe enough to be included in the study. PMA timeline, as I mentioned, this is kind of the granddaddy of all the submissions. These can go, for years sometimes. They end up with an approvable order or approval letter, lots of steps. I'm not going to go into that in depth right now. I'll leave this to you and to take a look at later. So I'm kind of getting a little bit more into breakout topics here. Let me take a moment. All right. So this is just a couple slides on the quality system regulation. We touched on that a little bit earlier. Quality management system is your documentation system that basically outlines all the procedures that your team is following when you're developing medical devices. And, obviously I'm speaking very colloquial language here, trying to kind of dumb things down. So there's a lot more nuance to things, but this is the body of evidence and documentation that FDA would inspect when it comes for an inspection. Remember the discussion about registration and listing. So the registration listings like, hey, FDA, I'm open for business. And this is what you need to have in place in order to be ready for an inspection with FDA. Dan Goldstein from our quality management team, he's a senior director of quality management. He favors more of a just-in-time quality system, which is basically very minimalistic, doesn't necessarily require every document that you may or may not need. And his focus is often getting you ready for that eventual inspection and making sure you're not adding things to your procedures that you don't need, because that just makes your inspection harder. So it's definitely recommended to do this at least with a little bit of guidance from someone like Dan. He's been doing this for over 30 years, maybe longer actually. And basically it's telling you that your quality system applies to Part 820 of the quality system regulation in the United States, which is similar to ISO 13485. I want to make sure you guys know that adherence to 13485 is not enough for FDA. There are slight differences. Most of them have to do with the information that you include in a quality system. It's often the case that things coming from the EU require us to work with people to figure out what that difference is. Faisal?
Yes, so I'm curious about the difference because there is, of course, the quality management system regulation, the final rule. And my thinking or my understanding is that it is supposed to harmonize more with the traditional ISO 13485 standard. And are you saying that that is not the case?
So FDA has a very specific version of ISO 13485 that they recognize, and they only recognize it for very specific needs. So the new QMS final rule is closer to being harmonized with 13485, but it's not complete. One of the situations that we run into quite often with companies coming from the EU into the United States is they'll follow 13485 about how much documentation that they need to create for their device. Most often they'll come and not have like a design history file because they say, oh, my device is class A. Well, FDA doesn't recognize those classes for, they have their own system for documentation. On top of that, FDA expects Class C documentation for everything, including Class A devices. They make that very clear in their software guidance that the guidance that they have about software that you provide to FDA, say, is like part of a 510K de novo PMA IDE, is only telling you what you have to provide to FDA during that review. It doesn't tell you what you have to have in your quality system. FDA's expectation for the quality system is that, using FDA's terminology now for like a basic device in terms of documentation level, if they asked for the documentation that would normally go with an enhanced device, you should have it. Like, we've seen people get caught off guard and, you know, give FDA this argument, oh, but we're class A, and FDA's like, sorry, we don't recognize that. Please provide us this documentation. So just something to be aware of, that there's similarities, but they're not the same, even now. That being said, I would have loved it if FDA had just gone straight to 13485, but, you know, I guess that wasn't in the cards. FDA is slow to change. They came a little bit closer, but unfortunately, their recognition of 13485 is still limited. I am not a quality management system expert, by the way. I know enough to basically say that.
But
One
Alex,
more, yeah.
no, sorry, Faisal, you could finish if you have more.
Yeah. How much do the consensus standards that may be related to your specific technology help with regards to making sure that it is even more compliant with regards to what FDA wants?
A lot of times you have to look at those consensus standards and understand if FDA recognizes that standard. And, you know, I don't know it off the top of my head, but there's a website you can go to that will talk about FDA's recognized standards. And oftentimes they'll have notes there for just how much they might recognize a particular standard. Sometimes it's fully, sometimes it's partial. When it comes to like ISO 13485, they only recognize a certain version. I don't remember which one that is off the top of my head. But for those consensus standards, I would suggest kind of looking that up and understanding, because, you know, that's where that discussion might play out as part of the review for your specific device. You know, there may be expectations that FDA has for testing, or, you know, especially for things like orthopedic devices where there's a consensus standard on the testing that you might need to do for like trajectory or position for like a stereotactic navigation system, for example. I don't remember the standard for that. I'm also not a standards expert. I just know enough to talk about it in general terms. So it's probably not very satisfying. The answer in general is it depends.
Sure.
So I'm not going to get too deep into the other things related to 820 here, just because I can't really speak to them as well as Dan could. But this is what I was talking about earlier in terms of how Dan generally approaches implementation of a QMS. He's not a fan of like software that comes with all the procedures that you need to start a quality system. He bootstraps one from scratch. And basically, he spends time with you identifying your initial policies and procedures, rolls these out. Phase 2, you'll have your quality manual, policies and procedures. Phase 3 is just kind of everything else that you might need to get up and running. Again, this depends on your particular device and your preferences. There's multiple ways to do this right. But this is very different than what I will say is there's a lot of software companies out there that just want you to buy kind of a quality management software, and then you figure out all these. It basically provides you everything you might need, and then you kind of have the problem of figuring out what you actually need. So if you go too much, you're going to have a lot of work on your hands that you don't need to be doing. So that's also kind of why I tend to recommend more of this phased implementation. It's kind of what you need when you need it, as opposed to all at once. You know, if you have deeper questions on quality management systems, you know, we can always arrange a call with Dan Goldstein and your company just to kind of get a feel for him if you wanted to consider having him participate in some of your activities. Really briefly, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on expedited pathways like breakthrough device designation. Again, I'm not going to get into reading all these criteria to you. The breakthrough device designation is based on this idea that, you know, breakthrough devices are a technology that satisfies kind of an unmet need, or is, you know, breakthrough better than kind of some of the existing devices on the market, The main criteria there is that, it provides for effective treatment or diagnosis of life-threatening or irreversible debilitating diseases. Reasonable expectation of technical and clinical success is what you're looking for there. And then criteria 2 is that you have evidence that shows that you actually have something to talk about there. I mean, it's very rare for FDA to give a breakthrough based on just literature alone. A lot of times you have to have some evidence that you've achieved a certain level of, as they say, a reasonable expectation of technical and clinical success. The clinical success kind of falls into a little bit more here with criteria 2, but I'm not going to go very deep. Kind of the sister program here is the Safer Technologies program. It's very similar to the Breakthrough Device program, but this is more for devices that don't necessarily improve from a breakthrough perspective. It's not like you're increasing performance by 20% or something like that. But this is for devices where their breakthrough essentially, and I say that breakthrough very loosely, is that they're safer than other devices. So both of these, the reason they call them expedited pathways is once you complete this submission, you have expedited access to FDA. As long as they have the bandwidth to work with you, you can usually have sprints, which is kind of like a Q-sub, except on a faster scale. It has certain benefits associated with it that are supposed to get you onto the market pretty quick. A little bit of criticism of FDA here. This program really hasn't done what it was designed for. A lot of times people are interested in breakthrough just simply for a reimbursement perspective and don't really care about the expedited access with FDA. And it's been my experience, it's kind of hit or miss. Some FDA review groups give you expedited access, others give you a cold shoulder. It just depends on the team. There are definite reasons to approach and go after these types of submissions. However, I'd say the benefit most of the time is outside of FDA in being able to claim, I'm a breakthrough device. I'm a safer technology. It usually helps with fundraising and things like that. What pathway should I be considering as a question that you might want to ask? Often that's the output from the regulatory strategy services that we do. Basically, we go through everything that we've talked about here and figure out what the path for your device is, what's the best. And then once we're done with that regulatory strategy, the next step is to go and do it, which we also offer services for that. So filing logistics, I'm getting pretty close to the end here. These may be outdated, but they still kind of give you a feel for how much these different submission types cost with FDA. For a lot of you, one thing that you may want to look up again on the internet is the small business designation with FDA. This can be very useful for allowing you to have access to these costs in the right panel here instead of the left. The standard fee, for example, for a 510K is around $20,000. Small business is about $5,000. It makes a difference, especially with things like, do they have de novo? De novo? It's a pretty big difference. These numbers have gotten quite a bit bigger recently with Medufa 5. Sorry, I have Medufa 4 here. I didn't update that. But these still should give you a feel for what these costs are. So they have increased by a certain percentage with Medufa 5. So here's a little bit more detail on that small business application. I do include a link here. This is something that we've helped some of our clients with before. It's not something that I know how to do personally, but we do have people that can answer questions related to that. Although from what I hear, it's just an exercise in form filling. But the most important thing is, just like anything with the US government, it's going to take a while. So make sure you're planning ahead. Don't submit a small business application at the last minute and think FDA is going to turn on a dime. So the moral of the story here is plan ahead. So it looks like I'm coming up on the hour here. I can pause here for a few questions. I would like to take a quick break, bio break, and I'm sure you guys might want to do one as well. So let's go ahead and get into questions if there are any, and then we'll take maybe a 5 to 10 minute break after that.
Any questions from the audience? Otherwise, I have plenty.
I have one from previously, the QMS one. I was just thinking, like, if you have a product and you want to go for both the US and EU market, if you then implement the QMS system after FDA standards, do you know if that will then be enough to cover the European standards or requirements?
I think that overlap may be a little bit of, there may be some things that 1345 asks for that are not in there. I just want to leave room for that. Again, I'm not a QMS expert. Most of the time, my focus is on the things that are missing from FDA, not vice versa. So I'm not able to answer that maybe quite as efficiently as some of my other colleagues. But I wouldn't assume. I would make sure that if you're going after both, that you're asking these questions of your quality management. If you have somebody that's on your team that's like your quality manager, or you've got a consultant that you're working with, these are questions that I would ask them to make sure that you have the right things for both of these environments, because they, as I mentioned earlier, they can be different.
Yeah. Also, yeah. Okay. Arkan, you would like to
that's
add or?
no, that was so I think that's fair.
Okay. Excellent. Also, maybe just a quick question before the break, Alex. Do I must have US data if I want to apply for the 510K?
Generally, the rule of thumb for any submission is FDA likes to see 50% US data. That's
50%.
not always true. There's times when FDA makes exceptions. They'll tell you that they make exceptions. The only thing that I can tell you is that doesn't happen very often. So 50% US data would be my expectation for anything that you're seeking to do here in the US. Either that, or you're going to have a really good justification that FDA will accept. We've seen companies spend a lot of time on justification, arguing with FDA, and really at the end of the day, the only thing FDA has to say during the call is, we disagree. It's very frustrating, but that's usually what it comes down to.
Makes sense. Thank you. Okay, so if there are no more questions for now, should we take a break, Alex?
Yeah, how about we meet back here at 9:10 and we'll get into the digital health specific topics.
Wonderful. So 10 minutes bio break, guys. Grab some coffee and see you in 10 minutes. 3:10.
All right, back. Got about 1 more minute here.
Mhm.
All right, we're at 9:10. Thanks for the opportunity to rest my voice a little bit. Appreciate it. Let's get on with things more into the digital health focus side of things. These may be a little bit more engaging for some of the things that you're doing. The first topic I'm going to go over here is clinical decision support. The main thing that I'm trying to teach you about with clinical decision support is that it's not what you think it is. And I think, at least from my own experience, there's a lot of wishful thinking from industry about what clinical decision support is and what it isn't. So maybe a little bit of an explanation here, and I'll admit a lot of this terminology is infuriatingly, the wording that they used for the law makes it challenging to talk about. But basically, Congress passed a law on clinical decision support and gave 4 criteria that you have to meet in order to qualify for the clinical decision support exemption. And what that means is that if you meet all 4 of those exemptions, or I'm sorry, all 4 of those criterion, you are exempt from the definition of a medical device. And then you would be considered clinical decision support. One of the things that I really don't like about this is that even FDA sometimes talks about device clinical decision support, non-device clinical decision support. I think they've kind of overcomplicated things here, and it's made things hard for industry to understand. So, one of the main things from the law to point out here, the opposite of non-device clinical decision support is not device clinical decision support. The clinical decision support exemption is designed to tell you whether you're a medical device or not a medical device. So that's kind of one of the more important things, at least from understanding the law here. One of the things that often confuses a lot of people here is that things like computer-aided detection and computer-aided diagnostics aren't really clinical decision support. They don't qualify for this exemption because they fail some of these criterion for being exempted. So the unfortunate thing also is that clinical decision support as a name was a terrible choice because it makes it sound like the device supports clinical decisions, or the software supports clinical decisions. It technically does not. So kind of getting into that, this is just some of the things that I've experienced talking to people about saying, oh, well, I can go on the market with FDA because as long as I'm not providing a final diagnosis, I'm clinical decision support. Sorry, wrong. I'm just low-risk software that aids the doctor. They can override. Well, that's the case for 95% of the AI that FDA has cleared. Actually, more like 99%. The diagnostic output only supports clinical decision-making. Again, it's an unfortunately named section of the law. It isn't about supporting clinical decisions. It's just that the name of the exemption is called clinical decision support. So, a graphic that FDA put out to kind of help people understand this, still not perfect. It kind of backs up some of what I'm saying here. It's based also on those 4 criterion. What I'm going to do here, actually, I think I skipped that slide. So here, these are the 4 criterion. And in order for you to be considered eligible for the clinical decision support exemption, you have to meet all 4 of these at the same time. Probably the most important thing here for the first one is that you're not intended to acquire, process, or analyze a medical image or a signal from an in vitro diagnostic device. Basically, what that means is if this is an output from another medical device that you're including as an input to your device, you're not clinical decision support, even if it's in the medical record. If you're taking that output and that's a key part of your device, you do not qualify for the clinical decision support exemption. The second one is that, and this, I'll give you a preview here. The second, third, and fourth is kind of a big run-on sentence. It's all one idea together. But basically, I've only seen true clinical decision support software maybe once or twice. And literally the way they describe it here is what they expect it to be in order to qualify for this exemption. Intended for the purpose of displaying, analyzing, or printing medical information about a patient. Okay. A lot of people speed right by that one because that's kind of what a lot of diagnostic devices do. Medical information, though, has a very specific definition for FDA. It's not the same thing as diagnostic information. So it's right out of the bat with number two, it's just not something high risk. It's intended for the purpose of supporting or providing recommendations to a healthcare professional. The thing that's really important about this this line here is there's a keyword there, about. You can't separate the about. The information that you're providing is about prevention, diagnosis, or treatment of a disease. You know, American Heart Association guidelines for a healthy diet. That's a recommendation for here. So like, if you're pointing to things based on entries, you know, from their EMR that this patient really should go on a diet and follow these recommendations, that's partially clinical decision support. The fourth criterion here is really the one that separates kind of low-risk devices from high-risk devices, in the sense that you're not really providing diagnostic information here. Make sure you understand, I'm not saying diagnosis, I'm saying diagnostic information. So when you provide a recommendation, let's just stick with that American Heart Association guideline, it's for the doctor to interpret. Your device shouldn't interpret it for them. You shouldn't use any of the classifications as part of any of these guidelines. You shouldn't do things like with lung rads or BI-RADS in kind of the cancer space. You shouldn't, that's not clinical decision support. So again, you have to meet all four of these at the same time. And interestingly enough, what you kind of figure out that what's left over, what actually qualifies for the exemption, it has a very specific use, but surprise, surprise, it's not very risky and at the same time, probably not extremely useful. So just encouraging you not to go out there and crow about how my device is clinical decision support. I don't have to get a 510K. I could show you numerous, or I could probably bring one up here pretty quick if it was desired, but when FDA decides that you're out of compliance, like marketing a device that you shouldn't, they'll send you a warning letter. So there's warning letters up there that basically say, you claim that your clinical decision support for this functionality, we inspected you and confirmed that this is part of your medical device. You provided rationale why your clinical decision support. Two very important words. We disagree. End of story. You're not clinical decision support. So far, this has only been for high-risk devices. I'd say there's a lot of companies out there that have things on the market that technically aren't clinical decision support, but they say it is. So just be wary of that. Just because somebody else is breaking the law doesn't mean that it's right. So sometimes that's an opportunity, sometimes that's a challenge, but you know, FDA's had a really hard time kind of distinguishing for this. You know, a great example here, for the longest time, you know, companies were claiming that sepsis detection was clinical decision support. No, it's a diagnostic. So, you know, answering the CDS questions, and the nice thing is there's now a de novo that has been gone through for a device called Prognosis. The de novo is there if you wanted to search for that and see the regulation as well as the review for that from FDA. You could type that in and see it. It can be a predicate for a similar device. But one of the things about Prognosis, you know, the first criterion is, are there outputs from other devices? A lot of times in the IVD space, you're taking inputs from the EMR of basically IVDs that were run. So like if you're taking an IVD test, putting it in the EMR, and then claiming, oh, this is not diagnostic information, it's not a magic trick. You can't just turn something from a device to not a device by putting it in the EMR. So, if you're using inputs from other IVD tests, you would fail right off the bat the first question for the criterion. This software identifies patients that are at risk for developing sepsis. This isn't medical information. This isn't related to guidelines or material for somebody to interpret. This is related to the diagnosis of sepsis. So you fail criterion 2. The software does not output information about sepsis. It outputs a risk score. Well, risk score is diagnostic information, so fail criterion 3. The output is intended to be an aid for diagnosis. Immediately, fail criterion 4. A lot of AI devices aid in diagnosis. That's not an excuse to qualify for clinical decision support. So you can kind of see that this whole controversy about sepsis amounted to next to nothing, because now you have a device on the market and this is settled. So this is just a good example to highlight that misinterpretation of clinical decision support. I mean, there are people out there that are challenging this from a legal perspective. I don't agree with them personally, but if it yields something useful, good for them, we'll see. So what I also did was kind of put together maybe something that may be clinical decision support. So the software searches for 37 distinct inputs from a patient from the EMR that do not include outputs from a medical device. Pass criterion 1. Software identifies medical information related to risk factors. Association guidances, papers from literature. It's just gathering it all into one place. The software transparently aggregates these 37 risk factors, presents them to the physician, and they decide what to do with it. The device cannot decide. So in that case, it would pass. The device does not output any scores, rating, triage, categorizations, conclusions, or anything related to these guidelines. It's left to the physician. So this may be clinical decision support. It only takes a little bit of nuance for it to kind of move from one side of the line to the other. Hopefully this kind of gives you an idea of what clinical decision support is outputting. And honestly, you're not providing a diagnosis for thyroid cancer screening. You're providing information that helps you as a doctor understand what factors to look for and what things to consider about these particular patients. So like if these things appear in their clinical record and it's all together in one place, that's clinical decision support. It's kind of setting the doctor up to make a decision by putting all the information in front of them, as opposed to outputting a diagnostic or a diagnosis. So hopefully that's a helpful explanation there. I'll pause there if there's any questions about clinical decision support. All right. So let's move on to good machine learning practices. This one is probably really important for a lot of you folks. I will say I should have that guidance, that draft guidance out, because it has a lot more detail on this topic at this point. I just haven't had a chance to formalize that in some slides yet. So basically what I have here is this used to be the information that was out there from FDA that kind of hinted towards the types of things FDA is looking for from AI machine learning. These are still the basis of a lot of the things that are in that new guidance. It's just that you're going to see a lot more specificity in the AI machine learning device function guidance, the draft that I was mentioning to you earlier. I'm going to highlight a few of these just because they're common pitfalls. Number 3, data should be representative of the patient population in the United States. We already had that great question earlier. How much US data do you need? Off the cuff, 50%. But FDA is very concerned about AI machine learning devices being trained and validated with data from the United States. A little bit more emphasis on the validation. One thing that FDA has started doing with number 4 here and really kind of tightening up on is that they strongly believe that training and validation should be from different sites, meaning that your validation data set should come from separate sites completely from the data that you use to train. It used to be they would accept kind of a temporal split or some sort of data curation to keep those data sets separate from the same site. My experience is they no longer accept that. Having said that, I recently had a submission where they kind of got caught up in the middle of this, and FDA was trying to say this is our guidance, and it was like, hey, FDA, your guidance wasn't out when this company started developing this device, so it doesn't apply. So we might have squeaked one by kind of recently. So that was a little bit of a challenge to get that by FDA, but you know, just giving you a heads up that you need complete site separation between your training and validation these days. And validation is more on the side of clinical validation, kind of like your final test that you've got an endpoint associated with for FDA. Truthing methods, you know, is another area that I've seen a lot of companies kind of not do well. A lot of times cost is a thing that drives this, in the sense that FDA wants US board certified clinicians to be establishing the ground truth. They don't want graduate students. They don't want people that don't practice medicine. They want the expert, even if they aren't normally doing this task as part of the standard of care. You know, there's a lot of times where a technician is actually the one doing this, but FDA still wants the ground truth to come from a board certified clinician. So those five, or those three in the middle there, are some of the things that we've run into. You know, the most common mistakes that I've seen: over reliance on OUS data. You know, I'm sure you got a lot of help from the Danish government and maybe the Swedish government opening your hospitals and having data available. It's only going to help you so much. As I mentioned earlier, FDA's expectation is no more than 50% OUS data. This one for number 3, not collecting a diverse data set. This one's in a little bit of flux, just simply because the new administration has kind of canceled all the diversity initiatives. So FDA had a draft guidance out for health equity, and the Trump administration deleted it. So it's unknown at this point if this will continue. But generally speaking, up until recently, FDA has required that you have a detailed analysis of race, ethnicity, gender, and information from a subgroup analysis that basically is there to eliminate uncertainty about performance across these different groups. Sometimes this subgroup analysis is more about clinically important variables, you know, different populations within a population. Oftentimes it's about race, ethnicity, and gender, because as you know, there's some devices that vary widely based on gender. Also, you know, there's been cases like the pulse oximetry where skin color has a big effect on the effectiveness of those devices. But up until recently, you know, FDA applied these concepts across the board, regardless of whether there was some reasonable expectation that there would be a difference based on race, gender, ethnicity. So they just wanted to see the data. It's unknown to me at this point whether that's going to continue, because it was part of some of the diversity initiatives from FDA. They had their center priorities for health equity, which have also been deleted from their website. So kind of an unknown gray area at this point. I certainly would recommend that you make sure that your data sets are diverse and represent your intended use population. The American population is rather diverse, and make sure that your data set represents all Americans, not just a few. Most of the time, you know, disadvantaged groups are kind of missing from these trials, hence the initiative from FDA to increase the enrollment in some of these trials. I don't have a great answer for you if that practice is going to continue for the next 4 years, but it's still something you may want to think about. Not collecting test data from separate sites. A lot of times companies want to only maintain 3 sites rather than 6, for example. You know, there's an obvious cost savings there. FDA doesn't care how much your study costs. I can't be any more blunt than that. They don't care. So that's not a good excuse for FDA. They won't accept it that it's expensive. Doing truthing with technicians is something that I've seen happen quite often, or graduate students or something like that, just because it's less expensive than using US board certified clinicians. FDA won't agree with it, and they won't accept your justification, even though they will tell you you can provide a justification, but I can tell you they're not going to accept it. Training and validation mismatch. This is basically when your device is doing one thing and your claims are another thing. You know, like in the stroke device space, it's a good example would be hypointensities. You know, a lot of times that's what a intracranial hemorrhage is called before it's decided that it's an intracranial hemorrhage. So you'll have a device that claims that it's for intracranial hemorrhage, and then you'll see that there might be a little function in there that throws out noise. It's like, well, what's this noise? It's like, well, these are things that aren't intracranial hemorrhage, and we want to make sure that this, and it's like, aha, FDA will say your device is for intracranial hemorrhage. It's not for hypodensity. So that often is a reason why FDA will deny a device, is just because there's a mismatch. Go ahead, Oded.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. So let's say that I am a very enthusiastic entrepreneur, and I want to write on the website, we are reducing workload by 80%. We haven't applied it for the FDA, but that's a plan based on the data that we have. Can that harm my application?
It can if you're making it in the application.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes those types of claims turn into FDA claims because that actually may be part of the intended use for your device. Again, there's a little bit of an it depends there, but that's very commonly a thing where, you know, your labeling will say, oh, we've reduced caseload by 80%. What FDA will come back with in your deficiency letter will be, you made a claim that your device reduces workload by, you know, efficiency by 80%. However, you didn't provide any data that supports this claim. Please provide data, or alternatively remove this claim from your labeling.
Mm-hmm.
Honestly, a lot of times people don't have the data to back it up.
Yeah,
Has been my experience.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Another common GMLP mistakes, we've already kind of hit on this one earlier, claiming that your device only helps clinicians. It doesn't provide a final diagnosis. Doesn't work. You can't say that. Won't help you. FDA's heard this so many times, they just brush it off. Claiming device input is generalizable to other manufacturers without evidence. That basically means, like, if the input to your device is like a Philips ultrasound system, and that's the only device that you tested your software with, FDA is going to limit your intended use to that system. They're not going to allow you to use it for any ultrasound system. You have to demonstrate that it generalizes across, you know, other manufacturers, for example. So, as I mentioned earlier, FDA doesn't give anything away for free. And then, you know, other mistakes, not thoughtfully addressing the US patient population. This is a little bit controversial at this point, just simply because I don't know if this is going to be something FDA continues to try to regulate. I often kind of worry for some of my peers back at FDA. You know, I don't know the answer to this question, and I worry about some of my colleagues going a little too far with this and then getting fired, because they seem to be very serious about removing DEI stuff from the federal government. So it's kind of a wait and see. I just don't know. Anyway, just kind of as a quick case study here, this is kind of a scenario that I've seen repeat itself multiple times. I've interacted with medical executives at, say, like a top 10 medical device company. They decided, in order to run a lean study, they choose to run the study entirely outside the US, use in-house technicians for truthing, gather all cases for training and test from the same 3 sites with a temporal split. So yes, that study costs less than what FDA wants. So they save money in the short term. The result, when this submission goes to FDA issues deficiencies for, 1, the data isn't representative of the US population. The deficiency tells them to gather US data and make it part of their analysis. The truthing method doesn't use the best available truthing method. FDA's deficiency says redo the truthing. That's usually the biggest part of the expense for these types of devices, is doing the truthing. The testing is biased because training and test data are from the same site. Gather different data or run a new study. That's the kiss of death. So I've seen this happen multiple times where someone is insistent that this is the way that they're going to do it. They're going to convince FDA that they know better and that this will work. All FDA has to do is say, sorry, we disagree. So I just wanted to put that out there, that this is a bad strategy for interacting with FDA, because if you really think about it, any cost savings that you leverage from doing the study that way get lost in the fact that you're going to have to redo your entire study. It's better to do it right the first time than it is to do it twice. So I'll pause there for questions. All right, these last couple ones here are kind of short sections. So if you guys don't have any questions for me, maybe we'll have a little bit of extra time at the end and sit in awkward silence for a few minutes. But
just time to process.
Yeah,
it's very, very.
Yeah, and I've got time up until 10 o'clock. I can answer more questions if you have them that you've written down. Although I do have to leave at 10.
Yes.
Cybersecurity. This has changed dramatically even compared to 2023. Basically, a lot of laws came online from Congress. Cybersecurity is your responsibility. It's not the hospitals. It's not the users. If you put that in your labeling, FDA will say, that's cute. Try again. So if you have software as part of your medical device, you are going to be doing cybersecurity. If your device has software or firmware, you basically just have to provide software documentation and cybersecurity documentation. One of the things that I don't recommend doing is trying to fight FDA about doing cybersecurity, basically revealing to them that you've done nothing. Not only are you going to have to still do it, FDA is going to treat you poorly because they realize you haven't done anything. So they're going to be extra hard on you, whatever you do, because they realize you're playing catch up rather than actually doing the right thing. FDA has about 20 template deficiencies with multiple subparts. We see them often just cut and paste into submissions. Their review template, they just click a button, it appears. It's very easy for them to write a cybersecurity deficiency. A lot of times they have multiple subparts, and they don't often spend the time to explain each of the subparts. It's all up to you. So it's usually better just not to get those deficiencies if you can help it. Generally, FDA said that industry is not doing a good job with cybersecurity, and they intend to get tougher. I expect that will continue. So the bottom line for cybersecurity, be prepared, do the work up front. It's a lot harder if you wait to do this until the time you're interacting with FDA, because FDA will be twice as hard on you, maybe 3 times as hard. Really quickly on software, FDA finalized a new software guidance in 2023. It used to be FDA had minor, moderate, and major. If you're still following the old guidance for your development and you're using that as part of what you're submitting to FDA, you'll get a deficiency. Hey, you need to use the new terminology and provide the things from the new guidance. There's a lot of things where FDA clarified things that they had wanted all along. One of those things I had mentioned earlier is the difference between, in your design history file, they always kind of expected that major and enhanced documentation were kind of part of your QMS. This was kind of back to that class A, B, and C discussion that we have. There's a lot of regulatory consultants and quality system consultants that get this wrong because they think that class A, B, and C apply for FDA, and they do not. They are useful, and there are certain things about 62304 that are useful, but FDA doesn't have a one-to-one adherence to that. It was on my wish list, but it didn't happen. The other thing is the risk management file documentation. It used to be the hazard analysis with the old software guidance was the whole point. The whole point of this QMS documentation is to reduce the risk profile of your device by mitigations. They're still going to be looking at that, but they're asking for more things. They're asking for kind of the full risk management file rather than just the hazard analysis. So there are material differences for those things. Also, cybersecurity is interwoven into the review of software documentation. A lot of times if I am taking a look at your software documentation before it goes to FDA and I can't find anything about cybersecurity, I'll ask where it is, because FDA will ask where it is. Cybersecurity should include requirements, design specifications, verification, validation, just like any other part of your device. So that's kind of my high level for some of the differences for cybersecurity and software. I'll pause there for questions.
Yeah, I see that there are 2 questions here. Suren and Mirel, maybe you want to turn on your cameras? just say it, or do you want us to read it?
So
To read, okay.
Yeah, I'd like. May I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. You said about the cyber security, about different requirements of the FDA. Now, we are certified for SOC 2, and we're in a process to also certify for ISO 27001. How much of an overlap is that with FDA requirements?
I would say
Is it
some.
already
I'm not an
HIPAA compliant as well? Yes.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on cybersecurity to the level of depth to answer these completely. But what I can tell you is that FDA relies heavily on their cybersecurity guidance. When we work with a client, and that's Nidhi Ghani from earlier, Nidhi does a gap analysis with a company based on what FDA is asking for in their guidance, as opposed to using some sort of standard or security requirements or anything related to HIPAA. So right off the bat, I can just tell you that we don't use any of those for preparing you for cybersecurity. I should probably point out the difference between regulatory cybersecurity, which is kind of satisfying FDA for the documents that they want, versus actual cybersecurity. There's a lot of things there that you're mentioning that are probably good practices and things that FDA might expect to be going on in the background. But a lot of times it isn't enough to satisfy FDA. The benchmark is going to be the final cybersecurity guidance from FDA. So that's why we use that as part of our gap analysis for preparing a client for a submission.
Okay, and another question about the risk management. Again, ISO 14971, that is mandatory for MDR in Europe. Maybe there's an overlap to what you said there about the risk management file.
I mean, yeah, you see a lot of 14971 procedures as part of quality systems. It's very easy to see as part of hazard analyses and things like that. So again, I'm not an expert on those particular standards. But as I mentioned earlier, they will get you most of the way there, but you still have to make sure with the FDA that you are accounting for what's in their guidances, because oftentimes what you have to be careful of is that FDA may not subscribe to the same approach that the EU does. I know that's probably not answering things specifically, but one interesting thing I can tell you is that FDA does not regulate HIPAA. They will look at your cybersecurity controls. You should be protecting health insurance, privacy, forget the whole acronym there, but you should be protecting patients' data as part of your system. However, if you have a lapse in HIPAA or you have a data leak or something like that, it's not going to be FDA that's going to come knocking on your door. It's going to be Health and Human Services. So you will not see deficiencies from FDA related to HIPAA. But if your cybersecurity isn't very good, you will get deficiencies from FDA. Let's see.
Great. And then we have about Canada. You mentioned about data before. So someone from Selfback is asking, as far as he knows, FDA approvals are valid in Canada, but can a study data from Canada also be submitted for FDA approval, as long as the majority of data comes from the US?
Well, I mean, you satisfied the 50% US data requirement, so sure. It doesn't necessarily mean that the regulatory mechanism that you used in Canada will work in the United States, but you may be able to use that same data set for a US application. I'm not sure about FDA approvals being valid in Canada. It's not my space. I don't think that's true, but I think I could be wrong. Usually those are things that my international team would handle questions like that, but I'm a little skeptical that that's true.
Yeah.
Let's see. Any other questions at this point?
Doesn't seem so. Yeah.
So this is actually a pretty interesting topic these days, is predetermined change control plan. This is my last topic for the day, so hopefully we can get this one done in the remaining time. We'll start with predetermined change control in terms of what it is. Basically, if I were to boil it down to plain language, it's the ability for you to make changes to your device for functionality that previously you had to come in for a new 510K for FDA. So basically, you're laying out your performance testing, you're laying out the changes to your device intended use, changes to your labeling document. Sorry if my kids are coming through the filter here. So basically, it allows you to do things that normally you would require an FDA submission for on your own without sending for example, a 510K into FDA. Used strategically, it can be a pretty useful thing. However, one of the things I will say is that most of the companies I work with greatly underestimate the amount of documentation FDA wants to allow a PCCP. So, kind of getting into things a little bit here. FDA has a draft guidance. Now it's a final guidance, at least for the AI machine learning device functions. They changed this from machine learning device function to AI device software function. That's good. It'll make sure that guidance lasts a little longer. But it basically still provides some of these things here about where it can be used, how it can be used. I would not recommend just drafting a PCCP and just throwing it in your submission just haphazardly. What I've seen people do is have like a 3-page PCCP they toss into their 510K, and FDA will give them like 20 or 30 deficiencies related to it, just because it tends to be more of a activity that's more like 50 to 100 pages worth of documentation. So the level of specificity, the level of documentation that FDA is asking for is pretty high. So in the end, the main thing for a predetermined change control plan for any of these mechanisms, the first thing you should be doing is determining whether it's worth it. There's a lot of situations where it's not worth it. I'm actually very skeptical that the AI machine learning device PCCPs are useful, just because FDA ends up being so narrow in how they're used that it really boxes manufacturers in a way that by the time you start with your PCCP and what you end up with, we've had several clients sure, they could have done what FDA wanted to get the PCCP cleared, but their comment was, this is essentially worthless at this point, just because of the level of rigor that FDA wants and how much they limit the applicability of the PCCP. So I highly suggest, talking to someone like myself or others that have experience in PCCP before you throw something like this in. It's a lot more work than you think it is. And basically, PCCP is a mechanism that allows your device to evolve for things that FDA would typically require a new pre-market submission for. The nice thing about this is supposedly it saves FDA review staff time, and it allows your device to evolve faster in a controlled fashion. However, my experience with that has not been kind of that glowingly positive, because if I'm being critical of FDA here, they can't seem to understand situations where it's a low risk function and it would save them time. But they'll put a lot of exponentially great effort into the review, and then it results in nothing. So just wanted to make you aware of that. Some different ideas of how PCCP can be leveraged. For AI machine learning, the basic idea is improving the performance of the algorithms over time. The data management activities that are now in that final guidance are substantial. So I would definitely point you to the AI machine learning device function guidance for PCCP. Luckily, that's a final guidance. A lot of what you see in the AI machine learning guidance also apply to non-AI things. Some of the things that you can also consider doing, and I think it's one of the more popular ones, is adding new outputs or adding new inputs. Oftentimes, like that example I gave earlier about an ultrasound system, you might put together a plan for including different ultrasound systems in your device indications for use. Also, I have seen PCCPs for things like porting from iOS to Android or vice versa at a later time when the company decides that they want to do that. Basically, that's pretty easy because you can just take the validation that you did for iOS, and roughly say it's going to be the same thing you do for Android. I know it's not exactly the same, but it's similar. Make plan modifications to hardware. I haven't seen one like this before, but it's kind of the idea that, for certain low risk changes, maybe like updating the Wi-Fi chip for cybersecurity reasons or things like that. Maybe things that you'd be able to do. And when you do your EMC testing, you may have a PCCP there that basically, as long as you pass it, you don't have to come back to FDA. So those are examples of the types of things you might see. So a lot of these are aspirational here in terms of different things. If you're going to be doing a PCCP, you're going to have to be monitoring the performance of your device in the post-market. There's no way around it. It does enable meaningful post-market monitoring. FDA thinks that's the best practice anyway, to make sure you understand how your device is performing in the field. It's other possibilities is biocompatibility for low-risk devices, for example, ultrasound probes, adjusting to real-world performance. I'd kind of put this in as an aspirational thing for health equity. We tried it with FDA and it didn't work, so I have to kind of take that one back. Performance testing governed by standards. That's kind of one of the easiest things for FDA to sign off on from a PCCP perspective, is when FDA accepts those standards as the testing that they want, you can say you'll follow the standard, and then you don't necessarily have to come back to FDA. It's an easy PCCP for them to sign off on. Although I think, they're still going to have a high bar for making sure that you're documenting your processes and procedures for achieving that. That's more of a quality systems activity. We already discussed expanding interoperability and compatibility with devices. Some of the mistakes that I see for PCCP, give me a moment here, get a little stuffed up. All right. In terms of modifications and overall concerns, it used to be people didn't know they had to identify the PCCP in the cover letter for the submission. FDA now has in the final guidance basically a list of things that you have to do in order for FDA to recognize the fact that the PCCP is part of your submission. If you include it and it's not obvious that it's there and FDA discovers it later, it's not cleared. Also, just a general rule of thumb is your PCCP longer than 10 pages. If it's not, it's probably a red flag. You're not doing things at a sufficient level of detail. Are the modification protocol, and these impact assessments traceable? It's a best practice. If FDA can't follow the steps that you're laying out to execute the PCCP, they won't let you use it. Another thing you need to ask from a business perspective is, this PCCP I'm putting forward the same amount of work as a single 510K? If you don't have like a specific benefit from going onto the market when you choose to, it may not be worth it. So you really should consider that from a business perspective. There's no prestige associated with having a PCCP as part of your 510K. It won't gain you anything unless it actually gains you something tangible for you. So make sure you evaluate that. The biggest and beefiest part of the PCCP is often the modifications protocol. That being said, modifications, the current guidance is AI focused, but as you can see with other guidance that are out there, it applies to non-AI things now too. Another question is, how specific are the modifications you're proposing? Non-specific, open-ended, basically non-predetermined modifications, keyword there, predetermined, are not things FDA is going to accept. You have to, if you're going to be adding additional ultrasound systems as inputs to your device, you have to identify them. It's that level of specificity. It's not going to be an open-ended procedure that you can just add any ultrasound system at any time. Are there modifications proposed specific enough? We kind of covered that with the 10 pages rule there. If you're not specific, FDA will ask you to be more specific. Is the protocol acceptable, detailed enough for FDA to agree? Kind of harping on the same thing here. If you put low effort in, you're going to get a lot of deficiencies back from FDA. And, honestly, a lot of companies that do that, they end up withdrawing the PCCP and either not pursuing it or pursuing it at a later time. The impact assessment is kind of an important part of this. Kind of think of it as a risk analysis for the changes that you're proposing with the PCCP. Basically, it's helping you make sure that you're accounting for all the risks related to your change with the impact assessment. This includes things like labeling, intended use, and various other things. It's really kind of a gap analysis of sorts when it comes to your risk management file. Is your plan for communicating labeling changes sufficient? I've seen FDA kind of get a little bit more particular about this. They want to understand exactly how you're going to change your labeling when you implement your PCCP. It can't be, oh, we'll figure it out when we get there. Is the intended use of your device conserved? This is a little bit of a gray area to a certain degree, but FDA doesn't want you to get new indications for use for your device because of a PCCP. That's a little bit of a nuanced statement because when you're adding additional ultrasound systems, as an example, that's technically changing your intended use. But when it comes to the overall intended use of your device, perhaps like to detect breast lesions with your software, that would be expected to be conserved. So there are some changes to intended use allowed, which they've clarified with the new final guidance. But you really shouldn't be making major changes to your intended use through PCCP. And again, back to that gap analysis idea, your hazard analysis should be looking at how these changes to your device, when they're implemented, are going to affect the risk management for your device. So that's generally what I have for PCCP, and it's kind of bringing us to the end of the presentation. I'm going to pause here for questions. I see we have about 5 minutes. Just a recap here of the topics that we covered, and just kind of reiterating some of the policies from the beginning of the call. You have the recording that Oded took, and you also have the slide deck.
Wonderful. Alex, really, thank you so much for taking us through this very, very complex topic and also being under the weather and doing it in the morning. Really highly appreciated. You see all of those like virtual claps here. So Thank you so much for that. Definitely there is a lot of things to learn.
Yeah, thanks for putting up with my going off camera a few moments. Hopefully I spared you anything there. So.
Oh, thank you. Do we have more questions from the audience? Or everything more clear? Or yes, Mirel, go ahead.
Hi. About the good machine learning practices, we ran a gap analysis last year. We don't have a medical device, but we plan on that in the future. So we already ran our internal gap analysis for those principles. And we expect that we apply all or at least most of them, even if some are not like really in a procedure, but we know that we are following that principle. But what I'm asking is, we didn't really find how we can document this. I mean, these are principles. They're not very detailed, at least as far as I can see.
Well, luckily at this point, we have the draft guidance that's out. Matter of fact, I can actually share the link for that if I can just dig it up real quick so you'll have it. I would recommend using that.
I found it before.
Somebody else got it already.
Yeah, I found it before when you were speaking, so I shared it now.
Yep,
the link.
That's the one. So that actually is not the guidance itself. That's a web page. Let me find this. Might be a little bit challenging for you to find. Here we go. Here's the draft guidance. I'll put this in the chat for you guys to take a look at. So FDA gets a lot more specific for this draft guidance. I can confirm to you that this draft guidance these principles are something that they're already applying in the review of these devices. if you choose not to follow some of the recommendations that they have here, you do so at your own peril. I just got a 510K back from them just recently, and it was very nitpicky about this new guidance. So they've got their new toy to play with, and they're trying to exert their influence on AI design. Probably the biggest thing that's going to hurt a lot of people is just having that site separation between your training and your validation. That's not optional. I can't say that enough. That I realize that'll save you some money, but it will actually cost you more money in the long term.
Yes. Are there any
Another
more
thing that
questions? Yes.
Yes.
Just Alex, do you have more time? Just to be sure that we are, or you need to go to a meeting.
I've got a meeting to go to. You know, Oded, if there's interest in people digesting this and maybe coming back for like a Q&A session at some point, I'm happy to do that.
Wonderful. And I will connect you. I'll share the contact details so everyone can explore synergies together, because there is a lot to learn. Thank you so much, Alex, and talk soon.
Yep, I wish you all the best, and hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, and have a good morning and feel better. And for
Thank you.
the Danish people, the Danish stakeholders, please just have a look for a moment. There are many more activities in the pipeline, both for Health Hub Copenhagen and Health Hub Pathway. So please have a look at the Airtable. Lots and lots of discounts for you as well that you can tap on the Airtable. And for us to better understand how we can better serve you, please scan the code in the right corner and tell us what you think, how we can improve, how we can bring you better value. So just we ask one minute. Sarah worked very hard for that survey. Okay, so just so we can get that input. Highly appreciated. Everyone can take their phone for a moment. This one. And if you have any questions about the delegation to Minnesota or other activities, any help that you need from us, just let us know. Great. So with that, we'll say thank you so much and see you soon in our next events.